My mother called me at 9:47 p.m., the exact night I signed the closing papers on a $4,350,000 house on Ocean Bluff Drive, and told me she and my father were moving in the next morning, because my husband had already given them a set of keys. If you're watching this from a city you had to leave behind just to breathe again, comment below and tell me where, because you already know exactly what this is going to cost me. Hit like and subscribe now, before I tell you what I served my parents for breakfast the morning they arrived. My name is Elena Vance, I'm 35 years old, and 3 weeks before that phone call, I had quit my job as senior forensic partner at Hargrove & Stone, a boutique financial crimes firm in downtown San Francisco, after 11 years of tracing other people's stolen money through shell companies, offshore accounts, and falsified ledgers. I didn't quit because I was tired of the work. I quit because the partners finally paid out my equity buyout 18 months early, $6.1 million after taxes, and because 3 days before that check cleared, I had opened my husband's laptop looking for a hotel confirmation and instead found a folder labeled Q. I didn't open it yet. I want you to remember that detail, because it matters later. What matters right now is that I used a piece of that buyout, cash, no mortgage, no cosigner, to buy a 5-bedroom glass and cedar house on a bluff above Carmel Bay, because I wanted one place in the world that was entirely, unambiguously, only mine. There were 3 things pulling at me the night my mother called. 3 threads I want you to hold on to, because I'm going to pull each one tight before I let it snap. The first thread was financial, a wire transfer of $210,000 that had left our joint investment account 4 months earlier, routed through an LLC I had never heard of, called Marlowe Bluff Holdings. The second thread was personal. A woman named Vanessa Cole, 31, who my husband introduced to everyone as his executive assistant, and who had texted him 41 times in a single Tuesday, according to a phone bill I was not supposed to see. The third thread was the plan already forming behind my calm face, quiet and unhurried, because I did not cry when my mother told me she was moving into my house. I smiled, and I started planning the kind of welcome that people talk about for years. My husband's name is Preston Vance. He's 38, and if you met him at a dinner party, you would think he built something real. He calls himself a boutique real estate developer, and he has a business card, a leased Porsche Taycan, and an office on the 14th floor of a building in Menlo Park with his name etched in frosted glass on the door, Vance Coastal Development. What he does not have, what I found out 11 days after we moved into the Carmel house, was a single closed development deal in the last 2 years. What he does have is $341,000 in unpaid contractor liens filed against a property he does not legally own anymore, a business checking account with $412 in it, and a habit of describing our marriage, to his mother, as a partnership where Elena handles the numbers and I handle the vision. I heard him say that through a cracked door on a Sunday afternoon, holding a mug of coffee that had gone cold in my hand. I want to tell you what our life actually looked like from the outside, because appearances are the entire engine this story runs on. To anyone at a dinner party, Preston and I looked like a matched set. The sharp, quiet wife with the good job, the charming husband with the vision and the Porsche, and the office with his name on frosted glass. What almost no one knew, because I never once corrected it in public, was that every mortgage payment on our previous house in Los Altos, every lease payment on that Porsche, every membership fee at the golf club where Preston networked 3 mornings a week, had been paid, for the last 4 years running, out of accounts that traced back entirely to my forensic salary and my performance bonuses. I did the math once, on a plane back from a deposition in Chicago, out of pure morbid curiosity. In 9 years of marriage, Preston's development company had generated, cumulatively, $191,000 in actual closed deal revenue. In that same 9 years, I had personally earned, before the buyout, just under $4 million. I never once said that number out loud to anyone in either family, because I understood, even then, that the moment I said it, I would have to admit how much of our shared life was a stage set I had been quietly funding. I married Preston 9 years ago, back when he actually had a small development company doing real work. 4 townhomes in Half Moon Bay, modest but profitable. Somewhere around year 4, the company stopped closing deals and started existing on paper, kept alive by transfers from our joint accounts that I told myself were loans, temporary, the kind of thing you do for someone you love during a rough patch. The rough patch lasted 5 years. During those 5 years, I built my forensic practice into the most requested in the firm, testified in 11 federal fraud cases, and never once asked Preston to account for where the money actually went. Because some stubborn, prideful part of me believed that if I asked too many questions about my own husband, it meant the marriage was already over. I know how that sounds, coming from a woman whose entire career was built on refusing to believe anyone's story without documentation. I made an exception for him. That was my mistake, and I want to be precise about that, because precision is the only thing I have ever trusted. My mother, Diane Marsh, is 63 years old, and she has spent those 63 years believing that comfort is something owed to her rather than something built. She grew up the youngest of four in a cramped house in Fresno, and she has spent every year since insisting, in small ways and large ones, that the universe still owes her the difference. She has one trait that repeats itself in every single memory I have of her: entitlement, worn like a coat she never takes off. When I was 9, she took the birthday money my grandmother mailed me and spent it on a haircut, telling me, "Family money is family money." When I turned 26 and bought my first condo, a modest one-bedroom in Oakland, she asked when she and my father would be moving in with me, as a joke, except it was never entirely a joke. Not once, not in the 15 years since. My father, Gerald Marsh, 66, has exactly one trait too. He is lazy, in the specific way that disguises itself as agreeableness. He has not held a job longer than 14 months in the last 2 decades, not because work isn't available, but because work requires effort he has never been willing to spend. And every single decision my mother has ever made, he has rubber-stamped with the same 3 words: "Whatever your mother wants." He said those words to me on the phone that night, right after my mother hung up, calling back from a different number because he just wanted to check in, which really meant he wanted to make sure I wasn't going to make this difficult. My younger sister, Kayla Marsh, 29, has one trait too, and it is opportunism, sharpened over a decade into something close to an art form. Kayla has never paid rent in her adult life. She lived with our parents until she was 26, then with a boyfriend for 2 years until he asked her to leave, then with me and Preston for 8 months that were supposed to be just until she got back on her feet, a phrase she has now used in front of me 11 separate times over 11 separate years. Kayla found out about the Carmel house from our mother 20 minutes after I signed the papers, and by the time my mother called me that night, Kayla had already texted me a photo of a moving truck reservation for a company called Pacific Coast Movers. Pickup scheduled for 6 in the morning, 31 hours after I'd taken possession of my own front door key. I stood in my new kitchen that night, granite counters still smelling faintly of the sealant the contractor had used that morning, and I looked out at the black water past the bluff, and I made a decision that I have never once regretted. I was not going to fight anyone that night. I was going to let every single person who thought they had a claim on this house walk directly into it, smiling, unaware, and I was going to document every single moment of it, the way I had documented every fraud case I had ever built from the ground up. If they wanted a reception, I was going to give them the most memorable reception of their lives. The first open loop, the financial one, started with that $210,000 wire I mentioned, sent from our joint Schwab account to an entity called Marlowe Bluff Holdings LLC on March the 14th at 11:52 in the morning, 4 months before my mother's phone call. I found the wire not because I went looking for it that day, but because I check our joint statements the way most people check the weather, out of habit, every Sunday morning with coffee. When I saw the transfer, I did what 11 years of forensic training had trained me to do instinctively. I didn't confront Preston. I opened a blank spreadsheet and I started tracing. Marlowe Bluff Holdings LLC had been registered in Delaware 14 months earlier, with a registered agent service in Wilmington and a single listed manager. A name I didn't recognize, a woman named Renata Ford. I ran Renata Ford through the same public records tools I used at Hargrove and Stone, and within 20 minutes I found her actual occupation, listed on a professional licensing database, notary public and paralegal, employed part-time at a title company in Monterey. The same title company, I would learn 3 weeks later, that had processed the paperwork on our Carmel house. I didn't stop there, because stopping at the first thread is how sloppy investigators lose cases. I pulled the LLC's filing documents, which are public record in Delaware if you know exactly where to look, and cross-referenced the formation date against Preston's calendar, which I could see because we shared a family account for scheduling. 14 months ago, on the exact date Marlowe Bluff Holdings was registered, Preston had a calendar entry that simply read Coffee RF, 90 minutes long, at a cafe 2 blocks from that same title company. I sat at my kitchen island with my laptop that Sunday, my coffee gone cold for the second time that month, and I felt something settle in my chest that wasn't quite anger yet. It was closer to recognition, the specific, cold clarity I used to feel in the moment. A fraud case finally clicked into a shape I could prove in court. I kept pulling. Over the next 6 weeks, working in the same quiet, methodical way I built every case at the firm, I traced 4 more transfers out of accounts Preston controlled, totaling $386,000 over 18 months. All routed eventually into Marlowe Bluff Holdings, which itself owned exactly one asset, a 40% equity stake in a parcel of undeveloped coastal land in Big Sur that Preston had quietly optioned, using money that was, on paper, half mine. I found the escrow documents. I found the notarized signature pages, and on one of those signature pages, dated 8 months earlier, granting Marlowe Bluff Holdings a subordinate lien position against our Carmel house, the house I had bought with my own buyout money, closed in my name alone. I found something that made my hands go still on the keyboard. My own signature, on a document I had never seen in my life, notarized by Renata Ford, dated a day I could prove, through my own calendar and a client meeting 300 miles away in Sacramento, that I had never set foot anywhere near Monterey. That was the moment Loop A stopped being a suspicion and became a case file. Preston had forged my signature to encumber the one asset I had built entirely without him, and he had used a notary who was also, apparently, someone he had coffee with for 90 minutes on the exact day he needed a favor no legitimate professional would agree to without one. I remember the exact physical sensation of finding that signature page, because I have spent 11 years teaching younger analysts what forgery actually looks like under magnification. And here it was, on my own kitchen island, at 11:40 on a Sunday night, the pressure points wrong, the loop on the E closing a half-second too fast, the kind of detail a jury would need an expert witness to explain, but that I could see with my own trained eyes in under 4 seconds. I zoomed in on the photograph I'd taken of the notarized page until the pixels blurred, and I sat there for 11 straight minutes without moving, the refrigerator humming behind me, the tide sounding faintly through the closed slider doors, and I did the thing I have trained myself to do in exactly this kind of moment. I made a list. Not of feelings, of facts. Date of alleged signing. My actual calendar for that date. Notary commission number. Cross-reference against the State Licensing Board's public lookup tool. LLC formation date. Registered agent. Every fact, laid end to end, until the shape of what had happened stopped being a feeling and became something I could put in front of a judge. Over the following weeks, I built a secondary spreadsheet, one Preston never had reason to look for because it lived on a laptop registered under my maiden name, purchased in cash from an electronics store in San Jose, the week after I found the folder labeled Q, a laptop I kept in a locked filing cabinet in my old storage unit, rather than anywhere inside the Carmel house. Every entry had a timestamp, a source document, and a hash value I generated for each scanned file. A habit from my forensic training that meant no one could ever credibly claim, later, that I had altered anything after the fact. I cross-referenced 4 separate transfers against Preston's business bank statements, which I was legally entitled to review as a joint account holder even though his development company's operating account was technically separate, because 2 of the 4 transfers had passed through our shared joint account first, a detail Preston's own bookkeeper had apparently never thought to hide, since he never imagined anyone on our side of the marriage would ever go looking. I found, buried in a scanned PDF of a county recorder's filing, the specific parcel number for the Big Sur land, APN 419-081-014, 11.2 acres of undeveloped coastal bluff assessed at $1.9 million, encumbered now by a lien of $410,000 in my name, a name I had never signed. I found the escrow officer's email confirming the closing, a woman named Priscilla Ortiz at the same title company that employed Renata Ford, and I found 3 emails deep in a thread Preston had apparently forgotten was still synced to a shared cloud drive from years earlier when we filed joint taxes together, a single line from Priscilla to Preston that read, "Renata says she can get this notarized by Thursday, just need the same details as last time." The same details as last time, 4 words that told me this was not a single desperate mistake. It was a method, refined, reused, comfortable. I called Frank Delgado 2 days after I found that signature page. Frank is 58, a retired FBI financial crimes agent who spent 22 years working wire fraud and mortgage fraud cases out of the San Francisco field office before he retired into private forensic consulting, and he had been a friend of my late Aunt Colette's for 30 years. Close enough that he walked me down the aisle at my own wedding when my father was too busy negotiating a business opportunity that fell through 11 days later. Frank had one trait I could always count on, unlike the people I grew up with. He did not flinch at hard numbers, and he did not soften bad news to spare anyone's feelings, including mine. "Send me everything," he told me over the phone, his voice as flat and steady as it had been the day he walked me down that aisle. "Every wire, every filing, every signature page. And Elena, don't confront him yet. The second he knows you're looking, he moves money, and then we're chasing air." I didn't confront him. Instead, I did something that felt almost unbearably strange. I kept living inside my own marriage as if nothing had changed, while building, quietly in a locked folder on a laptop Preston didn't know I owned, the exact kind of case I used to build against strangers for a living. I photographed documents on my phone and immediately deleted them from photo memory after backing them up. I requested notarized copies of bank records under my own legal right as an account holder, which is not something a husband can block, no matter how many passwords he changes. I asked Frank to run a formal license verification on Renata Ford, which came back exactly as I suspected. Her notary commission had lapsed 9 months earlier, meaning every signature she had certified since then, including the one on my forged lien document, was not just fraudulent, it was void from the moment of signing, a detail that would matter enormously later, in a room full of witnesses. The second open loop, the personal one, unfolded in parallel, in the kind of small moments you only notice once you've decided to stop looking away. Vanessa Cole worked as Preston's executive assistant for the 14 months since Vance Coastal Development had, according to its own bank statements, stopped generating enough revenue to justify an assistant at all. I found her name first on that phone bill, 41 texts in a single Tuesday, and then I found her again, 3 weeks later, on a hotel loyalty account, linked to a credit card that was technically mine, a card I had given Preston, for business expenses only, 2 years earlier, and stopped checking closely once I trusted him not to abuse it. 4 hotel stays, each one at the same boutique property in Half Moon Bay, each one billed as client entertainment, coastal parcel negotiation, each one coinciding, when I cross-referenced dates, with a calendar entry that read, site visit, never once with an actual site listed. I want to tell you about the night I finally saw them together, because it happened exactly the way these things happen in real life, which is to say, quietly, almost by accident, in a parking lot outside a restaurant in Carmel Valley, 11 days after my mother's phone call. I was there picking up a to-go order for a dinner I was hosting. I'll get to that dinner. And I watched Preston open the passenger door of his Porsche for a woman in a cream-colored coat, 31 years old, dark hair pulled back the exact way it had looked in a photo I'd already pulled from a real estate license database, because Vanessa Cole, it turned out, held her own California real estate license and had, 6 months earlier, been listed as a co-broker on the Big Sur parcel deal, the same parcel funded by the forged lien against my house. She wasn't just his affair. She was, on paper, his business partner in the fraud, and she had known exactly whose signature they were forging, because she'd handled the paperwork herself. I sat in that parking lot for almost 20 minutes after they walked into the restaurant, engine off, hands steady on the wheel in a way that surprised even me, and I noticed details I want to put on record here because they mattered later, in front of the board that revoked Vanessa's license. The cream coat was Burberry, the kind that runs close to $2,000 retail. An odd thing for a woman whose W-2 from Preston's barely solvent company would have shown, if anyone had bothered to look, an annual salary of $41,000. I photographed the license plate on the Porsche, the restaurant's illuminated sign for the timestamp context, and, through the window, the specific way Preston's hand rested on the small of her back as the host led them to a table, a gesture I recognized because it used to be mine. I didn't confront them in that parking lot either. I took 3 photographs from inside my own car, time-stamped, and I drove home and finished setting the table for a dinner I had already decided, 6 days earlier, to host for my entire family, on the same night I would finally close every loop I had opened. My mother, my father, and my sister arrived at the Carmel house exactly as promised, the morning after that first phone call, 31 hours after I'd taken possession of my own front door key. I want to be specific about what that morning looked like, because it matters. My mother stepped out of a rideshare wearing a cream linen dress she'd clearly bought for the occasion, sunglasses pushed up into hair she'd had blown out the day before, and the first words out of her mouth, before she even hugged me, were, "The listing photos didn't do the water view justice." My father carried exactly 1 suitcase, because he assumed, correctly, that I would eventually be asked to buy whatever else he needed. Kayla arrived 40 minutes later in an Uber she made me pay for through the app, holding a single duffel bag and already asking which bedroom had the best closet. I served them breakfast on the back terrace that morning. Eggs Benedict, fresh pressed orange juice, a fruit plate arranged the way my mother likes things arranged. Symmetrical, photographable. My mother took one bite and said, "This is nice, but we'll need to talk about repainting that accent wall. It's very cold." I smiled and told her we had all the time in the world to talk about it. And I meant that literally, because I had already scheduled everything that mattered for 6 weeks later, on a night I had chosen with as much precision as I chose the evidence in any federal case I ever built. Over those 6 weeks, I lived 2 lives at once, the way I imagine a lot of you watching this have lived 2 lives at once, smiling at a table while doing math no one else at that table could see. My parents settled into my house as if they'd bought it themselves. My mother rearranged the kitchen twice, donated a set of hand-blown glassware I'd bought in Portugal to a thrift store without asking me, and told a neighbor at the mailbox that she and my father were helping Elena get the house set up properly. She's never had good taste in furniture. My father spent most days on my terrace, on my Wi-Fi, watching golf, occasionally offering Preston business advice about the Big Sur parcel. Advice that made it clear, in ways my father never seemed to notice, that he already knew far more about that deal than an innocent father-in-law should. Kayla, for her part, moved into the guest suite with the ocean view I had intended for actual guests, and within 9 days had invited 3 friends up for a weekend, just to see the place, charging $412 in room service and spa treatments to an account she assumed was still linked to my card. Which it was, because I let it run, deliberately, documenting every charge the same way I documented every wire transfer. When I mentioned, gently, that we should talk about a plan for everyone finding their own place, my mother's response was immediate and, in its own way, clarifying, "If you don't like how we're living here, Elena, you're welcome to find somewhere else. This is a family house now." I smiled at her the exact way I'd smiled the night she first called me, and I said, "You're absolutely right. We should talk about that properly. At the housewarming." There was a second moment with my mother, 2 weeks later, that I want to describe in full, because it's the moment I stopped feeling even a flicker of guilt about what I already knew was coming. I'd hired a landscaper to redo the front beds, native grasses, and salt-tolerant sage, and my mother stood on the porch supervising a man she had never met and did not employ, telling him the sage should be moved closer to the door for the smell. And when I gently reminded her that it was in fact my landscaper and my house, she turned to me with the specific, wounded surprise she has deployed my entire life and said, "I raised you in a house I never got to decorate the way I wanted." I'm allowed to enjoy this one. I wrote that sentence down, word for word, in a notes app on my phone the second she walked back inside, because it was, I realized, the cleanest possible summary of 35 years. My comfort existing, in her mind, as raw material for her own. My father gave me his own repeating moment 3 days after that, when Frank called my cell phone to confirm a scheduling detail about the licensing board request, and I stepped onto the terrace to take it privately. My father, sitting 20 feet away with a beer and a golf broadcast, called out, not quite loud enough to seem like eavesdropping, but plenty loud enough that I knew it was intentional. "Everything all right with the money stuff, sweetheart?" When I said it was just work, he nodded and went back to the television, the same nod he'd given every single unresolved question in our family for 4 decades. A nod that meant he had clocked something worth knowing and had already decided it wasn't worth the effort of finding out. Kayla's second scene came the week before the gala, when she found the emerald dress hanging in my closet, still in its garment bag, and asked, without a trace of irony, if she could borrow it since you probably have something else for the actual party. I told her no, and she rolled her eyes and said, "You've gotten so uptight since you quit your job," which might be the single most accurate sentence anyone in my family said to me that entire summer, though not in the way she meant it. I had gotten uptight. I had gotten precise. There is a difference, and by the night of the gala, every single person in that family was about to learn exactly what it was. I want to pause here because this is roughly where I'd tell you, if we were sitting across from each other instead of you watching this on your phone, that if any part of this story feels familiar, if you've ever smiled through a room full of people who assumed your silence meant surrender, hit that subscribe button right now, because what happens 6 weeks from that breakfast is the part I built my entire career to be able to do properly, and you do not want to miss how it ends. The housewarming was Preston's idea, though I let him believe it was entirely his. He wanted a gala, he said, something that shows people we've arrived, and I agreed immediately, because a public event with witnesses was exactly the mechanism I needed, and because Preston, for all his forged signatures and hidden LLCs, still fundamentally believed that I was the same woman who had spent 9 years not asking hard questions. He booked a coastal event space attached to a private club in Pebble Beach, invited 80 guests, including 3 members of his extended family, 2 business contacts he was hoping to impress into funding the Big Sur project properly, and, at my quiet suggestion, framed as pure generosity, both of his parents and his sister, who I will introduce to you now, because they complete the picture. Preston's mother, Carol Vance, 61, has exactly one trait: arrogance, worn like a title she believes was conferred on her at birth. Carol has told me, more than once, at more than one holiday dinner, that Preston married down intellectually, but Elena has her uses. Preston's father, Walter Vance, 64, mirrors my own father in the specific, tired way of men who married ambitious women and have coasted on the reflected light ever since. Except where my father is passive, Walter is smug about it, treating his own idleness as a kind of earned leisure. Preston's sister, Brooke Vance Halloway, 33, has one trait: opportunism dressed as concern, and had spent the last 2 years quietly encouraging Preston to protect what's his in the marriage, meaning, I would later confirm through a single text message Frank pulled from a shared family group chat during discovery, encouraging him to move assets out of joint accounts before I got any ideas about a prenup renegotiation. 6 weeks of quiet work produced, by the night of the gala, a case file that would have made my old partners at Hargrove and Stone proud. Frank had confirmed, through a subpoena-adjacent formal request his consulting license allowed him to make to the title company directly, that Renata Ford's notary commission had lapsed on a specific date 9 months prior, invalidating every document she'd certified since, including my forged signature on the Big Sur lien. He had also, through a financial crimes contact still active at the FBI's San Francisco field office, confirmed that the wire transfers routing through Marlow Bluff Holdings crossed state lines in a pattern consistent with wire fraud, a federal offense, because the LLC's Delaware registration and the fund's origin in California created exactly the kind of jurisdictional trigger that moves a case out of civil court and into criminal territory. That contact, Special Agent Priya Nathan, had quietly opened a preliminary file 3 weeks before the gala, working from documentation Frank and I had assembled with the same obsessive precision I once used to put other people's spouses in exactly this position. I also, in that same 6 weeks, drove twice more past that boutique hotel in Half Moon Bay and confirmed, through a friendly conversation with a front desk clerk who had no idea what she was confirming, that Preston and Vanessa had a reservation booked for the night immediately following the gala, a small detail that told me everything about how confident Preston felt, how certain he was that nothing was coming for him. 3 days before the gala, Frank drove down to Carmel in person instead of calling, which told me, before he said a single word, that something had moved fast on the federal side. We sat on my terrace with 2 mugs of coffee neither of us drank, and he laid out, item by item, exactly what Agent Nathan's preliminary file now contained. Confirmation that Marlow Bluff Holdings had received funds from 3 separate wire transfers that crossed from a California-based account to a Delaware-registered entity and back into an escrow account tied to the Big Sur parcel. A pattern that satisfied the interstate element required to elevate the matter from a civil forgery dispute into a federal wire fraud investigation. Frank told me, in the same flat voice he'd used the day he warned me not to confront Preston too early, that Agent Nathan wanted 48 more hours to secure a cooperating statement from someone inside the title company, ideally Priscilla Ortiz, who Frank suspected would flip the moment federal agents sat across from her, because Priscilla had 2 kids in community college and absolutely no appetite for a fraud conspiracy charge. He was right. Priscilla gave a statement 2 days later confirming that Renata Ford had backdated at least one other notarization for a different client the previous year, a detail that would later be used to argue Renata's fraud was a pattern, not a one-time lapse. I spent those last 3 days in a strange, suspended calm that I now recognize as the same feeling I used to get the night before closing arguments in a case I knew. Absolutely knew I had already won. I confirmed the seating chart 3 separate times, making sure Renata Ford's invitation, sent, at my specific instruction, through Preston's own event coordinator so that nothing would trace back to me, placed her at table 6, close enough to the small raised platform where the microphone stand would be, close enough that no one in that room would have to strain to see her face when it happened. I confirmed, through the front desk clerk at the Half Moon Bay Hotel, that the reservation for Preston and Vanessa was still active for the night of the gala, room 214, check-in anytime after 6. I confirmed with the venue that the audiovisual technician could route a tablet directly to the room's main screen, with 60 seconds of notice. A technical detail I tested myself. Twice, standing alone in that empty event space on a Wednesday afternoon 2 days before the party, watching my own forged signature appear, enlarged, on a blank wall where 80 people would soon be standing with drinks in their hands. If you've made it this far without pausing, I already know something about you. You're the kind of person who finishes the receipt before deciding how you feel about the total. Comment the word settled below if you've ever smiled through a family dinner while quietly building an exit no one else could see coming, and hit subscribe now, because the next 10 minutes are the part I built this whole channel to be able to tell you properly. The morning of the gala, my mother asked me, over coffee, whether I was finally feeling settled in the house, and I told her, truthfully, that I had never felt more settled in my life. She took it as reconciliation. I meant it as a verdict. Preston spent that entire day on the phone with the venue and with 2 potential investors for the Big Sur project, rehearsing, I would later learn from Brooke's own careless comment at the party, a specific pitch about clearing up some paperwork technicalities before the deal could officially close. Technicalities he clearly believed he still had months to manage. He had no idea that Agent Nathan's team had already coordinated with the venue's private security for a discreet presence that evening, a courtesy extended because Frank's 22 years with the Bureau still carried weight with people who remembered his name. The night of the gala, I wore a deep emerald dress I'd bought specifically for that room, because I wanted to be remembered clearly in every photograph anyone took. 80 guests filled the event space by 8 o'clock, string lights strung along the terrace overlooking the water, a jazz trio playing near the bar, the specific hum of a room full of people who believe the evening belongs to celebration. My mother worked the room, telling anyone who'd listen that she'd helped Elena find her footing in the new house. Carol Vance held court near the dessert table, informing 2 of Preston's business contacts that the Big Sur parcel was practically closed, just a matter of finalizing Elena's paperwork. A phrase that told me, with total clarity, that Carol knew exactly whose signature had been forged and had decided it was simply the cost of doing business. At 9:15, Preston tapped his glass and asked the room for quiet, thanking everyone for coming to celebrate Elena and I building something real together. A line I let land fully before I stood up beside him, took the microphone from his hand with a smile that had cost me 6 weeks of silence to perfect, and said, "Before we celebrate, I think everyone deserves to actually know what we built." Frank was standing near the terrace doors, in a suit instead of his usual field jacket, and Agent Nathan, along with a colleague from the Bureau's Financial Crimes Unit, stood quietly near the entrance, having arrived 11 minutes earlier at Frank's invitation, credentials ready, waiting for exactly this moment, because I had told them, precisely, when to walk in. I told that room everything, in the same flat, documented voice I once used in front of federal juries. I told them about Marlowe Bluff Holdings, about the $210,000, about the $386,000 total, about a notary whose commission lapsed 9 months before she certified a signature that was never mine. I held up, on a tablet connected to the venue's screen, the actual lien document, my forged signature enlarged for the whole room to see, next to a genuine, notarized sample of my real signature that Frank had pulled for exactly this comparison. I told them about Vanessa Cole's real estate license, her co-broker status on the Big Sur deal, her hotel reservation for that very night, in that very town, 40 minutes from where we were standing. Carol Vance's face went the color of the tablecloth. My mother reached for my father's arm the way people reach for something to hold onto when the floor tilts. Preston tried to take the microphone back, tried to say the word context 3 times, tried to say the word misunderstanding once, and it was Agent Nathan, stepping forward with her credentials already visible, who ended his sentence for him, informing him and Renata Ford, who I had, with a specific, quiet cruelty I do not regret, also invited that evening, seated at table 6 between 2 of Preston's business contacts, that they were both being formally taken into custody on suspicion of wire fraud and notarial fraud, pending further investigation into the falsified lien. Renata's face when 2 agents walked toward table 6 is a memory I will keep for the rest of my life, purely because of how completely she had believed a 90-minute coffee meeting would never surface in a room this bright. The room did not go silent so much as it fractured into a dozen separate reactions at once. each one exactly matching the single trait I'd watched each person perform for 6 straight weeks. Carol Vance grabbed Walter's sleeve and said, too loudly, "This is exactly the kind of dramatics I warned him about," as if the fraud were an aesthetic failure rather than a felony. Arrogance holding its shape even as 2 federal agents crossed the room behind her. Walter said nothing at all, setting his drink down on the nearest table with the same unbothered slowness he brought to every crisis in his life, watching his son get read a set of rights from 6 feet away, like a man watching weather move through on a television screen. Brooke pulled out her phone before her brother had even finished being handcuffed, and I would learn 2 days later, through that same shared family group chat Frank had already flagged, that her first message to a cousin read, "Does this affect the trust distribution, entitlement, and opportunism arriving?" for her, in the exact same breath. My mother's hand found my father's arm the way it always does when the ground moves, but this time I watched her mouth actually open and close twice with nothing coming out, the first time in my entire life I had seen Diane Marsh genuinely without a script. Kayla, to her credit or her detriment, filmed almost the entire thing on her phone before she seemed to register that the man being let out in handcuffs was her sister's husband and not simply content for a story she'd post later. And when she finally lowered the phone, she looked at me and asked, in a whisper meant to be private and audible in equal measure, "Wait, does this mean the house thing is actually over?" As if the only casualty in the room that mattered to her was a spare bedroom with a good closet. Vanessa Cole was not at the gala. She was, at that exact hour, checking into room 214 at the boutique hotel in Half Moon Bay alone, waiting for a man who would not arrive that night or, as it turned out, for the better part of 2.5 years, a detail I confirmed the following week purely for my own satisfaction. The last small thread of Loop B tied off cleanly, without a single raised voice on my part. Agent Nathan walked Preston past me on her way to the door, and he stopped, for just a second, close enough that I could smell the same cologne he'd worn on our wedding day, and he said, quiet enough that only I could hear it, "You planned this whole night." I looked at him the way I look at a finished case file, complete, sourced, unimpeachable, and I said, "I planned every night since March 14th. He didn't have anything to say back to that. There wasn't anything left to say. I turned back to my mother before the room fully absorbed what had happened, and I said the exact sentence she'd said to me the night she called about moving in. Inverted, word for word, "If you don't like how this evening is going, Mom, you're welcome to find somewhere else to be." She didn't have an answer for that. Neither did my father, standing beside her with his hand still on her arm, the same "whatever your mother wants" expression frozen on a face that had never once, in 66 years, had to account for a decision on his own, and I remember thinking, in that exact second, that this was the first time in my entire life I had seen him look like he understood, at last, that some bills eventually come due. 11 months passed after that night, and I want to walk you through exactly where every single person in this story ended up, because vague consequences aren't satisfying, and I promised you specifics from the very first sentence. Preston pleaded to a reduced federal charge of wire fraud 8 months after the gala, avoiding trial in exchange for full restitution and 30 months in a federal facility. He lost his real estate license permanently, and according to a mutual acquaintance, now works answering phones for a car dealership in Fresno, the same city my mother grew up trying to leave. Renata Ford lost her notary commission for good, was charged separately with notarial fraud, and settled with a plea that cost her 11 months of supervised probation and a debt to me, in restitution of $41,000, paid in monthly installments she will be making for years. Vanessa Cole was never criminally charged, since she could prove she didn't personally execute the forged signature, but she lost her real estate license in a state board proceeding after Frank submitted the co-broker paperwork as evidence, and the last I heard, she'd moved to Nevada and works retail. My mother and father moved out of the Carmel house the morning after the gala, into a one-bedroom apartment in San Jose that my father, for the first time in 2 decades, actually had to get a job to help afford, a part-time position at a hardware store that he complains about to anyone who will listen. My mother has called me 4 times in 11 months, each call opening with some version of "we're still family," and each call ending, so far, with silence on my end that I intend to keep exactly as long as I want to. Kayla moved back in with our parents, into that one-bedroom apartment, sleeping on a pull-out couch, and texted me 2 months ago, asking if I'd consider helping her get her own place, just until she's back on her feet. A sentence I read twice, laughed once, and did not answer. Carol and Walter Vance stopped speaking to Preston entirely after the restitution payments started coming out of what remained of his half of our divorce settlement, blaming him, according to Brooke, for embarrassing the family, a family whose collective savings, it turned out, had never actually existed the way any of them pretended it did. I sold the Big Sur parcel, once the lien was voided and the title cleared, for $460,000 more than the forged encumbrance had ever represented, and I used that money, along with what remained of my buyout, to buy out Preston's name from the divorce settlement entirely, keeping the Carmel house free and clear, in my name alone, exactly the way it should have been from the very beginning. I made partner at a new forensic firm 8 months ago, the youngest managing partner in the company's history, and I specialize now, deliberately, in cases involving spousal financial fraud, because there is a particular clarity in helping other people build the case I once had to build for myself. My first client under that new specialty was a woman named Teresa, 42, a pediatric surgeon whose husband had quietly drained $300,000 from her retirement accounts into a cryptocurrency scheme he refused to explain. And the morning I handed her the finished forensic report, "Thick enough to need a binder clip," she cried, in a way I never let myself cry through any of this. And I understood, watching her, that the calm I'd built for myself in that Carmel kitchen had turned into something I could hand to other people now, like a tool instead of a wound. Frank still comes up to Carmel twice a year, and we sit on that same terrace, and he still refuses to drink the coffee I make because he says forensic accountants make coffee like they're rationing it, which is probably true. Renata Ford, once her probation ends next spring, will be permanently barred from ever holding a notary commission in the state of California, a detail Agent Nathan confirmed for me personally, unprompted, in an email I have kept, printed, in the same locked filing cabinet where this entire case began. Carol Vance, for her part, spent the first 4 months after the gala telling anyone who would listen that the entire prosecution was overreach against a family that built something, until the restitution garnishments started coming directly out of a trust account she had co-signed years earlier as a favor to Preston, at which point her tone changed considerably. She has not spoken to her son since the 11th month, according to Brooke, who called me once, unprompted, 8 months after the gala, not to apologize but to ask, with the same opportunism she'd shown in that group chat, whether I would consider writing a letter supporting a reduced sentence for the family's sake, a request I declined in 4 words and did not repeat. I drove past the hardware store in San Jose once, 4 months ago, on my way back from a deposition in Sacramento, and I saw my father through the front window, in a red vest with a name tag, helping a customer find something in the plumbing aisle, moving slower than I remembered, and I felt something I hadn't expected to feel, which was not triumph and not quite pity either, just a kind of settled, quiet recognition that consequences, once they finally arrive after 40 long years of being deferred, look exactly this ordinary, this small, this unremarkable. My mother works part-time now too, at a dry cleaner 2 blocks from their apartment, a detail Kayla mentioned to me in a text I did not respond to, though I did notice, and did not comment on, that Kayla herself still hasn't held a job longer than 4 months since that pull-out couch became a permanent address. I still sit on that same terrace most evenings, looking at the same water, and I think about the version of me who smiled instead of screaming the night her own mother told her to find somewhere else to live if she didn't like it. That version of me understood something it took my whole family a lot longer to learn. That calm is not the absence of a plan, it is the plan, executed in silence until the exact moment silence stops serving you. If someone in your life has ever told you that your success makes you an easy target for their comfort, I want you to ask yourself the question I asked myself on my own terrace, 6 weeks before that gala, with a glass of wine going warm in my hand. How long are you willing to smile before you let the whole room see exactly what you built? Somewhere across town tonight, there's a woman finding out her husband's business trip was never a business trip at all, and if that sounds like a story you need to hear next, you already know where to find it. You've sat through this entire story without looking away once, past every open loop, past every table setting, past every quiet spreadsheet built at midnight, which means some part of you already decided a long time ago that you're exactly the kind of person who finishes what they start. So,